There is a strange irony in the world we live in today, where images of half-clothed women flood every screen, where intimacy has been reduced to an algorithm's suggestion, and where the very act that once carried mystery, tension, and fire has become something men scroll past with indifference. Because when everything is available, nothing feels alive anymore, and the spark that was supposed to ignite burns out before it can even catch. Men of earlier centuries did not live surrounded by constant temptation, yet their hunger was fierce, their pursuit was deliberate, and their excitement often bordered on obsession. Today, the modern man is offered the shadow of desire in such abundance that the reality of desire itself has grown numb. He no longer trembles at the thought of closeness. He no longer feels anticipation in the touch of a hand, because in a culture of instant gratification, the mind adapts by dulling the very emotions that once gave meaning to pursuit. This is not a moral argument against sex, nor is it a sermon of purity. It is a recognition of a deeper psychological paradox that the philosophers already knew, that when desire becomes endless, it also becomes hollow. The more accessible pleasure is, the less weight it carries. Excitement is built on distance, on uncertainty, on the slow unfolding of something rare, and when that is stripped away by constant exposure, the experience collapses into routine. A man today finds himself caught between two illusions. On one side, the fantasy that sex will complete him, and on the other, the creeping realization that it no longer moves him as it once did. The contradiction gnaws at him in silence, and he begins to wonder if the fire is gone forever, or if the fire was never where he thought it was in the first place. Because the truth is simple and painful, it is not sex itself that has changed, but the man's relation to it. What once carried mystery has become a commodity, and what once awakened the spirit has been flattened into another distraction in the endless stream. To understand why sex no longer excites him, he must face not the act, but the emptiness into which the act has been thrown. Schopenhauer observed that the very nature of desire is a trap, because the instant it is satisfied, it ceases to exist, and in its place comes either boredom or the rebirth of another longing, which means that the excitement men chase is always tied to what they do not yet have, never to what they already hold. And this endless cycle explains why so many find their passion dying the moment their hunger is fed. To him, sex was the most striking example of this principle, because it appeared to promise transcendence, yet in reality it chained men to what he called the will, a blind, insatiable force that drives life forward without ever reaching fulfillment. In pursuit of a woman, a man imagines relief, purpose, even completion, but the moment intimacy is attained, the illusion cracks, and he finds himself not uplifted but emptied, watching desire dissolve into a need for the next high. This is not simply philosophy written in dusty books. It is the lived experience of countless men who confuse the chase with the meaning of life itself. They mistake the surge of attraction for the proof of love, only to awaken to the cold reality that the surge was nothing but the will using them as its instrument. What they thought was freedom was in fact compulsion, and what they thought was choice was simply nature pulling its strings through them. And so the excitement fades, not because the body is incapable of pleasure, but because the mind begins to sense the deception beneath it. Once the trick is seen, the old magic no longer works. A man who realizes that desire will only repeat itself like a wheel turning in mud cannot feel the same thrill he once did, for he knows the cycle leads nowhere. He is no longer blinded by the promise that fulfillment lies in the next embrace. He sees that every embrace is swallowed by the same silence that followed the last. Schopenhauer's warning to men was not to hate women, nor to fear desire, but to understand that what they call passion is often just the will pulling them forward, and that the real strength lies in refusing to be enslaved by it. The excitement that dies after sex is not a failure of masculinity, but a revelation of truth, that pleasure was never the answer, it was only the bait. A man rarely sees a woman as she truly is in the beginning. Instead, he sees a stage upon which his own fantasies are performed. And in those early moments of attraction, it is not her reality that excites him, but the story his unconscious is writing through her. He believes he has found passion, when in fact he has found a mirror that reflects back his own hidden longings, and like all mirrors, the image shatters the moment he looks too closely. Psychology shows us that much of desire is not about the other person at all, but about the projections we place on them. The woman becomes a symbol of purity, of danger, of conquest, of redemption, and the man's excitement grows because he thinks he is on the edge of discovering something larger than life. But when intimacy strips away the veil and reveals a human being instead of a symbol, the thrill collapses because the fantasy cannot survive reality. This is why so many men feel the drop after sex, not only because of biology, but because the image they were in love with dies the moment the act is complete. What he chased was not her body but the story he attached to her body, and once that story proves unsustainable, his emotions fall silent. He thought she was mystery, but she was a person. He thought he was stepping into eternity, but he was stepping into repetition. The danger is not simply disappointment, but addiction to the illusion itself. A man may move from woman to woman, chasing the projection of a new mystery, hoping to recapture that early rush, yet each time the pattern repeats, fire in the beginning, indifference at the end. He confuses the projection with intimacy, and in doing so mistakes his own shadow for love. The lesson here is harsh but liberating. Sex by itself cannot carry the weight of a man's unconscious longings. If he expects it to, the excitement will always fade. To keep looking for meaning in the same projection is to remain trapped in a theater of illusions, clapping for performances that never last. Real intimacy begins when projection ends, but as long as he demands excitement from the illusion, he will continue to feel the hollowness that follows. There was a time when even the suggestion of intimacy carried power. When a stolen glance or the brushing of hands could spark a fire that lingered for weeks. But in the age of endless images, dating apps, and manufactured desire, that same spark is buried under constant repetition, and what once felt rare now feels routine. Modern culture trains the male mind to expect stimulation at every moment. A scroll through a phone delivers more images of women in an hour than a man of the past might have seen in his entire lifetime. And the brain adapts to this flood by raising the threshold of excitement until almost nothing registers anymore. The very mechanism designed to respond to novelty begins to collapse under the weight of too much novelty, leaving behind not fire but fatigue. Science calls this dopamine desensitization, the dulling of response after repeated overstimulation. What this means in practice is simple. The more a man consumes artificial signals of sex, the less his body responds to the reality of sex itself. He finds himself restless, easily distracted, unable to feel the same intensity that earlier generations described, because his nervous system has been rewired to chase constant spikes instead of depth. But the problem is not only chemical, it is cultural. When everything around him whispers that intimacy is casual, disposable, and always available, the mind no longer frames it as sacred or mysterious. Sex loses its symbolic weight, becoming another product among many, and once it is stripped of its symbolic weight, its ability to excite naturally declines. This is why men who live under constant stimulation often feel strangely empty in real encounters. They expected an experience that would match the flood of fantasy, yet what they receive is quieter, slower, and human, and by comparison it feels diminished. The tragedy is that nothing is wrong with the act itself. What is broken is the man's ability to feel it, because he has trained his senses to be deaf to ordinary reality. The deeper danger here is that overexposure breeds contempt. What once was revered as powerful becomes seen as trivial, and when reverence dies, so does excitement. A man who consumes the image endlessly will always struggle to value the reality, and until he learns to starve the overstimulation, he will never feel the spark that once made intimacy burn. A man who builds his life around the pursuit of sex will always find himself restless, because the moment the act is over, he is forced to confront the silence of his own unformed purpose, and in that silence, he realizes that lust can distract him, but it cannot define him, for excitement that depends only on pleasure fades as quickly as the body cools. Masculinity has always carried a deeper calling, not simply to chase, but to create, to build, to leave something standing when desire is gone. The men who rise above the emptiness are those who shift their center of gravity away from the bedroom and into the world, who discover that excitement rooted in growth, mission, and strength does not collapse with time but compounds into power. When a man has no mission, sex feels like everything. When he has a mission, sex returns to its rightful place, not as the meaning of life, but as a companion to it. The men who burn out are those who confuse intimacy for identity, who believe their worth is measured in conquest or in validation. Yet the men who endure are those who anchor themselves in something untouchable, something no woman can grant and no loss can take away. This is why the modern crisis of excitement is not truly about sex, but about men who have been trained to see sex as the pinnacle of existence. Without a higher aim, their desire shrinks into obsession, and obsession inevitably breeds disappointment. A man who is building himself, sharpening his mind, strengthening his body, advancing in skill, discovers that women respond not because he chases, but because he grows. Excitement follows power, not the other way around. The paradox is that when a man finally stops needing sex to feel alive, he begins to experience it with new depth. Freed from desperation, he brings presence instead of hunger, and presence carries more weight than any performance of desire. The moment he steps out of dependence, he steps into true choice, and in that choice, sex regains a dignity it lost when it was idolized. The deeper lesson is that masculinity matures when it stops looking to women for its meaning. The man who builds from within finds excitement not in the fleeting rush of lust, but in the unshakable strength of a life aimed at something larger. Sex can then be enjoyed, but it can never again enslave, because it no longer defines him. The truth a man must face is that sex itself was never the problem, nor is the fading of excitement a sign that he is broken. It is a signal that he has mistaken a moment of pleasure for the foundation of life, and when pleasure is elevated beyond its place, it cannot help but collapse under the weight of expectation. What he calls boredom is in fact the exposure of an illusion, and what he calls disappointment is the unveiling of a truth he was not prepared to see. Philosophers across centuries warned that pleasure cannot carry the burden of meaning. The ancient Stoics insisted that desire without virtue becomes slavery. Jung showed that fantasy mistaken for intimacy leads only to confusion. Schopenhauer saw that satisfaction never ends hunger, but only awakens the next hunger. And Nietzsche argued that life itself demands a higher ascent than comfort. Together, their voices remind us that when sex becomes the center, emptiness follows. When sex returns to its rightful place, strength begins. The deeper warning is that a man who continues to measure his worth by how excited he feels in moments of lust will never escape the cycle of highs and lows. He will be mastered by moods, always searching for the next spark, always disappointed when the spark dies. But the man who accepts that pleasure was never designed to fulfill him gains a freedom that cannot be stolen, because his power no longer depends on desire. Sex loses its magic when it is made into a god, but it regains its beauty when it is allowed to be human, not a savior, not a curse, but a part of life that rests beneath the greater calling of purpose. The man who learns this no longer asks sex to give him excitement. He brings excitement to sex by being alive in his mission, steady in his strength, and unshaken in his identity. And so the question is not whether sex excites men, but whether men will rise high enough to no longer need it to excite them. For in that rising the hollow cycle breaks, and the man discovers that the deepest spark is not found in pleasure, but in the life he has chosen to build.